Great. So good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this fifth edition of the Ethical Humanitarianism Seminar, which is a collaboration between HUMA, as Institute for Humanities in Africa, and FIFE, which is the Freedom Cell Institute for Evaluation. This Ethical Humanitarianism series is created to have really critical conversations around questions relating to the humanitarian work on the continent, but also issues that relate to questions of development and also philanthropy, financing, funding, and broader questions that deal with being human, on the continent, being human in the world, and also how our experiences as Africans, can also contribute, to thinking about these humanitarian issues globally. Today we have really two great speakers, and these are two people that we already know, that we will not going to spend a lot of time introducing, and that you already know. And we're going to follow the same format that I will introduce the session. After that, we're going to have the two speakers speak. We will have Triasa to speak, and then Elisio then to speak. And then after that, Kweku is going to engage them in deep conversations. And during that period, if you have questions, please do not hesitate, to pose your questions. And then in the end, we're going to conclude and then end. Because we started late, we're going to roll over by 15 minutes. And I'm sure Kweku will ask to roll over by another 15 minutes. Like the last time, we beg your indulgence. We will make sure we don't go beyond this 1 hour, 1.5 hours, and we're begging the speakers because we know we have lots of questions, for the speakers today. Triasa Garvin is an academic and a senior lecturer researcher who is at the University of Botswana in the Department of Social Anthropology. She is a sociology, social anthropology by training. I actually grew up as an anthropologist under her. I went to the University of Botswana as a media and political science scholar, and I was an assistant to Triasa Garvin, who said, you must do anthropology, you must leave all of these things and begin to look for ways of immersing yourself in people's worlds. And I ended up working with her, teaching anthropology, and she was doing really fascinating work around migration, which is her area of speciality, and also doing work on refugees, both in Botswana, across the border, and particularly in Southern Africa. And we are really happy and lucky to have her today, especially somebody who understands mathematics and also technology, but doesn't like to engage with technology herself. So it's a privilege to have her to agree to be here. But then she sent me to the University of Basel in Switzerland, where I then met Elisio Marcamo, who joined us as professor of sociology, but also based at the Center for African Studies, where he was also director. And Elisio does really fascinating work, which is also grounded from his own training and also experience from Mozambique. These days, he's talking a lot about Mozambique and what's going on in Mozambique and why 1,000 Rwandan soldiers have come to do what many others can't do. But the fascinating work that I think Elisio has done and has contributed is especially around the scientific conceptual vocabularies, and his emphasis that we need, not necessarily to abandon the knowledge that we have inherited as we decolonize, but to seek ways of, rethinking and re-engaging or finding new scientific conceptual vocabularies, to explain our experiences, because it is not that we need to provincialize Africa or African experiences, but we need to actually use African experiences to enrich the world. And he's also given us through thinking modernity, thinking risk, and thinking youth and many other issues on the African continent. So it's just great, to have you two here. And Kweku, my brother, who is based in Germany, Afife, whom you already know, and also working on issues of humanitarianism and also refugee and cross-border work and migration. Last time when we were talking to him, he was just running to Mali, where we had just had a coup. So I'm not sure what he was going to do in that place, but it is good to have you here. So Kweku, I think we'll go straight to Triasa. After Triasa, we'll have Elisio, and then after that, Kweku can come through, also introduce Fife and himself, and then engage him before we go out. So thank you for being here. Triasa.
Okay, first of all, good afternoon or evening, morning if it's the case, everyone. Let me first of all thank Divine and Kwaku and those organizing the series for the invitation to present. It's a privilege, in fact, to present here, especially one being organized by Divine. It's also a privilege, Elisio, to meet you, even at a distance. So now I can see where he went when he ran away from me and UB. Colleagues, I wanted to this evening or this afternoon to look at some of the ways in which humanitarianism, broadly humanitarianism as an ideology and a practice, intersects with issues of migration or human mobility. In their report in June this year, the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, noted that at the end of 2020, 82.4 million people were classified as refugees globally. And that constitutes about 30% of the total estimated number of global migrants, which is 272 million at the end of last year. That figure for refugees and internally displaced people is also twice what it was in 2010. In other words, it has doubled in the last 11 years. And I think we all know that, conflicts and emergencies and crises get varying degrees of attention. They are politicized in various ways and to different degrees. And they are responded to as well in different ways across the globe. And one of the things you see within the field of migration is that the most obvious linkages between humanitarianism, or the notion of humanitarianism, and human migration is found within the field of forced migration. And humanitarianism emerges in a number of ways. We have some of what we call humanitarian spaces created, or short-term safe zones and corridors, to give safe passage to people in case of a natural disaster, man-made or natural conflict, and so on and so forth. So too, we have humanitarian governance, most notable in refugee camps, where humanitarian assistance is provided for people by either international aid agencies or aid agencies in conjunction with national governments or indeed local governments. And what you see in these humanitarian spaces, of course, and forms of government and types of assistance, is humanitarianism largely associated with some kind of human safety, or the notion of human safety, meeting people's basic needs of food, shelter, medical care. In other words, some way of, I guess, mitigating suffering in the midst of traumatic situations for people or emergencies. And looked at, I guess, if we only take what is made known publicly, often through the media, it looks a relatively up and running and incomplete or complete system. Yet what you find is that the humanitarian endeavor in relation to forced migration in particular is both selective and indeed quite incomplete. And that is even when it is necessary. And so at the moment, we have the situation where the African Commission on Human and People's Rights note that by about the middle of July this year, there were 732,000 people displaced in Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique, and that a lack of financial resources and linguistic and logistical issues have meant that the humanitarian response has been slow, or indeed in many cases completely non-existent. And at the same time, so that's, you know, an example of how incomplete this entire notion of having some type of humanitarian response to emergencies can be on the continent. And that is but indeed one example. We have similar example from Tigrayan people who fled into or felt they had to flee into parts of South Sudan last year, etc., etc. At the same time, when humanitarian spaces are created, when humanitarian assistance is provided, and when, you know, the full range of humanitarianism is so-called activated, it is problematic. And those problems are often highlighted in the work of people like Barbara Harrell-Bond, who in 1986 noted the way in which aid workers within refugee camps in Tanzania were either incapable or simply not willing to allow victims of abuse, or indeed those defined as victims, to take control of their own lives. And in the same way, more recently, writing in 2014, Aguirre looks at refugee camps as somewhat similar to prisons, noting that they are spaces which are in fact off limits. They are governed by special rules which suspend the principle of citizenship, and they're often thought to house people who are perceived to be unable to be integrated into the local community or society. And so what you see is both the problematic and the incomplete nature in different ways of the humanitarian endeavor in relation to forced migration. However, incomplete and imperfect as humanitarian responses to internally displaced or forced migrants may be, it does draw our attention to crises, to conflicts, to the need for a humanitarian response. But most importantly, it draws our attention to the vast swathe of migration globally that does not get any response, or that is deemed not to deserve the same type of response, the same type of humanitarian response as in the case of conflict or natural disasters and so on and so forth. And so what we find is that on a daily basis, very large numbers of people cross borders in very complex ways for multiple reasons, and multiple very complex reasons, in fact. When humanitarian assistance is provided, it's often limited, it's very focused and targeted, often poorly resourced, and certainly has no global reach. It's often evident in small systems of free legal aid, limited small systems of free legal aid for asylum seekers in some countries, special measures, limited again, created for the victims of human trafficking, or indeed local actions by communities and individuals to try to welcome the newcomer migrant into their midst. In contrast to that, over the past 18 months, and in the midst of this global pandemic, we continue to see people being deported as migrants, exposed, detained and deported, exposed to xenophobic attacks, and the emergence of, for example, electronic vaccination systems that have the potential to exclude migrants from vaccination, COVID vaccination process, most especially migrants who are undocumented in different societies. And of late, we have seen several European Union countries, such as Holland and Denmark, call for the deportation of failed asylum seekers from Afghanistan during a period when the very unpredictable and volatile situation was emerging in Afghanistan. Today, as we speak, we have Belarusian refugees stranded in no man's land between Belarus and Latvia. They cannot get into Latvia. They're not allowed into Latvia. They cannot go back into Belarus or Belarusian territory because they're not being allowed back in, so to speak. And so what these examples tell us is not only the discrepancy, the ways in which humanitarian assistance, humanitarian aid and humanitarianism has a specific focus on forced migration, or what is deemed to be forced migration, and the way in which it, if at all, deals in a paltry way with the needs of the vast swathe of migrants around the globe who are not, in fact, forced migrants. But these examples also draw our attention to a number of the common issues that arise all the time in relation to humanitarianism, such as who defines humanitarian interventions, who prevents that definition from happening, who designates what type of humanitarian need should be provided, who decides which groups of migrants are deserving, so to speak, of humanitarianness, and what basic needs are being defined within the whole space of humanitarianism. But what we see also in this situation is what I consider to be a second layer of incompleteness of the humanitarian project or the humanitarian endeavor. And this is an incompleteness at both the ideological and the practical level. I think in many ways, when we sometimes critique or look at the pitfalls of humanitarianism and humanitarian aid, we're often speaking of the practical reality of what happens in the examples I gave you in refugee camps, for example. In this second, so what I call second incompleteness of the humanitarian endeavor in relation to migration, what we're seeing is the limitations and the incompleteness at both the ideological and the practical level. We see, of course, in all of this, the politicization of humanitarianism. And Benthel, writing in 2018, notes that, of course, humanitarian aid has always been politicized, so that perhaps is not new to us. But perhaps what is more important is that it's not just the politicization of humanitarianism that we see in this second incompleteness of humanitarianism and its response to migration. We are also seeing the politicization of migration itself. And through this lens of considering the possibility of examining incomplete humanitarianness in the context of ordinary migration flows or large migration flows that are not necessarily forced in nature, we see a host of issues that emerge in relation to both migration and the very nature of humanitarianism itself. We see the politicization, of course, of mobility and human migration. We see the ways in which people's behavior is defined as human, what is human and what is considered not human behavior. We see the contradictions of the humanitarian system that strives to restore normality, and very often the people in question as migrants are looking for a new normality and a new reality. We see the use of migrant categories, labels such as refugee, asylum seeker, undocumented migrant, illegal immigrant, etc., etc. We see the use of these categories to normalize the notion that all migrants and by definition all people are not in fact equal. Rather, people can be categorized and accorded very different rights depending on their origin, depending on their means of movement, and all too often based on their ethnicity and indeed what some people would call their racial background. It is in this that we see the linkages, one of the key linkages between humanitarianism, borders, and migration, when we look at the security policies as crucial in conceptualizing the way in which we might begin to work through where the intersections are between humanitarianism, borders, and migration. And the ways in which, we see the ways in which people as migrants lose their humanness, which is constituted by their lives, in some cases, lose their livelihoods, their freedoms, their shelter, their food, etc., etc. In other words, the ways in which all aspects of migrant lives are treated as not necessarily having equal worth, as something that has become, or a facet of migration that has become normalized now, all too often in tragic situations that we see in places like the Mediterranean. So in this layer of incompleteness then, when humanitarianism intersects with broader migration flows, we see to some extent one of the contradictions which Fasson writes about in 2011. And in his notion of biolegitimacy, Fasson, of course, has the view that at the core of the humanitarian endeavor is the notion of physical man. And quite rightly then goes on to note that there's contradictions within the humanitarian endeavor, which mean that the importance attached to physical life is juxtaposed, I guess you could say, in that not all lives are in fact allowed the same worth. Not all behaviors are treated with the same worth. The exclusion, indeed, of the broader lives of people, as opposed to just their physical existence, the needs of safety, or the need for safety, and basic needs, and such as food and shelters. So in this way, then, what we see is the consequences of the politicization of migration. In other words, the incompleteness of the humanitarian project in relation to migration draws our attention to the many areas in which migration is politicized and to the consequences of that politicization. And these are what I would call unbounded areas of human migration. So when you look at the initial examples of the incompleteness of the humanitarian endeavor in spaces such as refugee camps, you might speak of incomplete humanitarianism in bounded spaces, because a refugee camp is a bounded space generally. In this context, when we speak of the broader migration flows that exist, we're speaking of the incompleteness of humanitarianism in its capacity to both conceptualize and deal with the unbounded human migration that takes place. And the consequences, of course, are there for all to see. It's because all life is not treated as equal in worth that the Mediterranean exists, the most dangerous border in the world, as al-Bahari says. It's because borders and migration are national security issues, increasingly so, that traffickers and smugglers, I guess one could say, have a field day, or perhaps that's why they exist in the first place. And it's because states and citizenship defines who belongs that we can use Agamben's state of exception to define spaces such as the Mexican-American border, or why we can look at al-Bahari's work on the Mediterranean, and in particular, the attention he draws to the institutional framework and structures and systems that migrants have to work within, or indeed live within. And it is from here then that we can begin to conceptualize what a humanitarian governance of migration might really look like. And the difficult questions that would have to be raised at the individual and state level in relation to what would humanitarian governance of migration look like. And finally, there is perhaps one other layer of incompleteness that is not necessarily linked to migration, or indeed linked to humanitarianism itself. And that is the incompleteness that can be found in the humanitarian practices and actions, and indeed ideologies, and the agencies associated with the implementation of humanitarian endeavors that fail to hold governments to account. And in failing to hold governments to account, of course, we have perhaps the ultimate failure of humanitarianism in the field of migration. I think I will end it there, Divine.
Thank you very much, Triasa, for such an engaging and rich conversation. We are going to just move straight to Eliseo Macamo. Thank you.
Thank you, Divine, and thank you, Teresa, for a very interesting presentation that actually makes my work a lot easier, because I thought that I would just bring up, if you like, a polemical, controversial reading of the topic that Divine has asked us to address. Now, here's a typical scene in many developing countries. I won't say which country this is because I want you to focus on the description. So people are assembled on the main square of a small town to bid farewell to 300 of their fellow city dwellers. They're going to try their luck elsewhere, far away from home. Now, 300, that's 13% of the total population of the town. And over the previous 50 years, the population increased by 83%. This meant that the pressure on natural resources also increased, a tough challenge for any developing nation. Added to this, the textile industry went into crisis, collapsing partly under the weight of global trends and international campaigns against child labor. Now, the town authorities cannot cope, of course, and they are particularly reluctant to continue spending their resources to support the poor. And in any case, the town's resources had been placed under severe strain by a recent famine that had cost the lives of over 1 million people in a neighboring country and forced over 2 million of them to migrate. Now, migration was not a new response to hardship. Over 3 decades, more people had out-migrated than had come into the country. And over a period spanning several centuries, successive governments had been quite good at exporting young men. Traditional local authorities profited from the business to fight holy wars against the enemies of the faith or imperialists of all sorts. Now you can call this jihadism if you like. And those who did not leave the country to fight in foreign armies occupied land in neighboring countries ravaged by wars themselves. They profited from the artificial nature of colonial boundaries. Now it is estimated that between 15,000 and 20,000 made this move into a neighboring country. And the never-ending colonial wars which ravaged local economies led to solid migration flows, many of which had a different continent as their final destination, because it was seen as a land of opportunity. So the 300 who assembled at the town's main square were among the first in what we might call mass migration. That is, in the next 10 years, more than 50,000 will have left the region, with 90,000 expected to go in the following decade. UNHCR experts forecast that in the next 60 to 80 years, more than 60 million people will leave this continent in search of better living conditions. Now, whether receiving continents will be able to withstand this pressure is an open issue. There is the word ethics in the title of this session. I understand ethics as a set of moral principles guiding behavior, our behavior. Now, I think this is the simplest definition of the concept, but using it with the notion of humanitarianism suggests, in some ways, an understanding of development cooperation as a response to a set of moral principles. So rich countries help because rich countries act upon their values. Now the question then becomes, what moral principles underlie humanitarianism? I think we all know the answer. These are principles to do with the obligation to help those in need and Triasa spoke about this, in pursuit of, if you like, higher human goals, because after all, we are all human. So rich countries help because they care about us. Now the subtitle, however, gives, as far as I'm concerned, the lie to this understanding. For the idea of borders stands in opposition to such moral principles. Migration is an essential human trait. When you are in need, you move. You don't stay put. That is why the Catholic Church ruled centuries ago that no Christian nation should prevent poor people from migrating if these were seeking to improve their well-being. Now, what makes this movement a problem is the existence of borders. So where you have borders, doing something as human as moving becomes a potential crime. Now, another way of putting this is the following. A coherent development policy responding to a humanitarian ethical impulse should be directed to borders, to dismantling borders, not to people on the move. Now, the reason why this is not done has to do with what Michel Foucault describes as the ethical substance. The ethical substance is the morally problematic aspect that requires reflection and which should ideally be transformed in one's ethical work, the work that one has to do. For example, myself, I procrastinate a lot. And because of that, I don't get things done. So this may translate into lack of respect for others, which is not a virtue, of course, but rather a vice. Now, in development cooperation, what is morally problematic is the inability of countries, and in particular of governments, to cater to their own people's needs. So to address this moral failing, they must establish a relationship to a moral code. And that moral code is a commitment to good governance, requiring countries to see their inability to discharge their functions as an internal, that is a domestic problem, which is to be explained by weakness of character, obnoxious cultural traits, and lack of a sense of responsibility, as well as the lack of the relevant set of technical skills. So to overcome this, developing countries must engage in ethical work, a sort of ascetics, if you like, which entails an honest confrontation with their moral weaknesses. And they should not blame colonial history. They should not blame capitalism. And they should not blame unjust economic structures, etc., for their failure to cater to their people's needs. They should set up NGOs to promote anti-corruption campaigns. They should sign agreements with donors to control their migrating youth. They should look on, as I've recently read, while the world pays out almost $25 billion to technical experts who advise Africa to be better behaved. So ethics is a pursuit of a goal, if you like, a telos, as in teleology. And the telos of development cooperation is a world of human well-being that is achieved by a sheer act of will on the part of those who face the challenge of finding their way in a world built by others for their own purposes. Now, the story I told you at the beginning about this typical developing country is one that I like to share with my Swiss and German audiences. Usually I ask them what they think the historical role of colonialism in causing migration was. I ask them whether migration can be seen as an asset or a burden. And finally, and this is the most challenging question, I asked them what developing countries suffering from migration or experiencing migration need to do to look like Switzerland or Germany one day. And the answer to the first two questions is a standard one. People think that there is no way to look at migration today without thinking about colonial history, if that is something that happened long ago. They also believe that migration can be an asset, especially if you think about remittances. Still, they worry more about migration being a burden because the continent loses its workforce, mainly the youth, and they hardly associate this argument with the slave trade in the past. Now, the answer to the third question about what these countries should do to look like Switzerland or Germany is much more complicated. Still, the overall tendency is towards the feeling that there's no way in which these countries could ever look like any European nation today. That is the moment when I tell them the truth about the description with which I started. In fact, the small town that saw 13% of its inhabitants living in one day was a town called Rotkreist in Switzerland in the 19th century. And all the things I said about famine, about young men fighting foreign wars, about local authorities profiting from that trade, all of those things referred to Switzerland in the same period. Even the UNHCR figures, of course, at the time, this organization did not exist. I had to build it into my narrative there. So even those figures about how many people would leave the continent were Europeans leaving Europe to America. So in a period of 70 years, about 80 million Europeans left Europe in search of a better life in America, Africa, and Asia. So compared to the number of Europeans who migrated in response to economic hardship, what we see Africans doing today over the Mediterranean is actually nothing. And overall, the number of migrant Africans in the world outside Africa is laughable. According to a French demographer at Collège de France, François Héron, people tend to migrate to countries with a similar level of development. So there are more European migrants in Europe than there are African migrants in Europe. And if you think seriously about this, what really poses a much more significant danger to European well-being, if you want to see migration as a problem, it is not illegal African migration. Economic growth in Africa will bring African countries closer to European levels of development. And therefore, it will turn Africans, make Africans potential migrants in much more significant numbers. So in a nutshell, and I'm coming to an end now, ethical humanitarianism, for me, might be a hoax, or at any rate, a terrible conceptual misunderstanding. Thank you very much.
Great. Now, Kweku,
thank you.
and over to you. And,
thank you very much, Alicia and Teresa. I think these conversations or these submissions are quite deep and thought-provoking. And I like it very much that both of you takes on, even though very, very deep and abstract way of looking at the situation or the issue we're talking about, you also bring it down to a practical way that we can conceptualize and actually work with it. Thank you very much. And before I start with some few questions, we already have 7 plus, so like 22 minutes to bring the discussion to an end. I will ask all our audience to kindly start submitting your questions. If you want to ask questions yourself, please do so. Just raise a hand and we will let you ask your question. But let me start with this. So first of all, so Eliseo, let's start from you. I think you touched on one of the basic reasons why Divine and myself decided on these themes and especially the broader ethical humanitarianism. Because as you said, it sounds, looking at the practice and also all the limitation and incompleteness that Tricia also mentioned, then why do we still continue to even imagine there is some sense of ethics in humanitarianism? It's a question of where when you bring it up, you have different school of thought actually fighting you to different levels of their capacity. But still, coming back to the main theme for today's discussion, do you think, and this might go to you as well, Teresa, that in talking about development cooperation itself, the concept of development cooperation, is it in itself a border to the idea of migration, the idea of humanitarianism? Because if we see these corporations as a way of deepening the politicization of migration, humanitarianism, and all these things, which in itself causes the incompleteness that Tricia was talking about, then what do you say to those who would bring forth this question that do the increasing cooperation in the name of development themselves becoming barriers, becoming borders, becoming hurdles for the same reasons why governments are now taking more and more interest in these topics, in these concepts that we are talking about? Because we see that through human development corporations, now humanitarian work is actually out of the hands of CSOs. You see CSOs begging for projects in the name from government and others as well. So what do you say to this? Are we getting to the point where these same effort, politicized processes, the formalization of activities, becoming borders in their own towards humanitarian work, towards development, towards migration, and all the other concepts we can think about? I think you can start with this reflection as I take other questions and pose them later. I hope it's clear. Okay.
Okay, Kwaku, I think one of the things which is very evident is, and it follows on from what Alicia was saying, the almost desperate efforts which governments who, are increasingly focused on policing their borders, the almost desperate efforts that are being made to prevent migration, and often through the notions of development aid. Sometimes it is almost downright bribery. So if you look at some of the agreements signed between the European Union and some of the states in West Africa, essentially it is as crude as going to a government that is, let's say, on the front line, to use that word, such as Morocco, or Burkina Faso or Niger, who may be, using Morocco as a migrant route, people from there using it as a migrant route, and offering in a very crude way humanitarian assistance money to put in place development projects that theoretically will create forms of employment, create some type of magical change in the situation to encourage people to actually stay and not migrate. Okay, so you've got that on one level, that clearly there are open attempts to use the international aid system and to use so-called money of development to try and impede the movement of people. On the other hand, the great contradiction is that as aid agencies come into countries and come with ideas and notions of what they want to do and what they do not want to do, they carry a baggage with them. And the baggage which they carry with them is that they come from often Western countries, perceived on this continent as rich, as having infrastructure and technology and so on and so forth. And that in itself drives the aspiration of perhaps younger people to want even more, to go to those countries, the same countries which they see on the television or in movies or whatever else. So it's a sort of a double-edged sword, what the impact is of so-called development aid on the movement of people. I mean, one of the things which has interested me in terms of the perceptions of Europe and of the West on the continent here over the past 18 months is the absolutely catastrophic situation in the United States and indeed in parts of Europe in relation to this COVID pandemic. When we're on a continent which, while badly affected, is nowhere nearly as badly affected as what we are seeing in places like the United States, Brazil, India, and indeed parts of Europe. What the perception is of people now of this dream place to which they would like to go. And at the same time, you get the complete contradiction, which is the situation whereby governments actively recruit migrants off the continent. So we have what I consider the disgraceful situation at the moment, where Cyprus, the United Kingdom, and the United States are actively recruiting nurses from Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe already has a shortage of nurses. It has, at the moment, the need and the demand for beefing up its nursing force because the vaccination program is dependent on the availability of nurses. In the midst of this, we have Zimbabwean nurses traveling to South Africa to write exams at the American and the British embassy to get their visas to then catch a flight to the UK. So it is, and that is because there is a shortage of nurses in the UK and the US, and it would also seem in Cyprus at this point. So there's kind of a multiple interactions there, at least my perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Teresa. Alicio, please.
Yes, thank you. I think I agree with what Teresa was saying. Maybe I should take this opportunity to do some advertising. So in my forthcoming book, which is called Sovereign Reason, I actually try to reflect on the epistemological problem behind that. So sovereign reason for me is not being aware of the inconsistencies in your own knowledge and in your own moral commitments. And it's what philosophers, logicians would call, relying on the Humpty Dumpty fallacy, from Alice in Wonderland. That things mean what you want them to mean at that particular moment that you are talking. But you are not bound by the meanings of your words beyond the moment you use them. So really, for me, one of the most difficult things about development cooperation is precisely that it seems to be based on an inconsistent commitment to the values, if you like, underlying you know, humanitarianism, the values underlying, if you like, European culture, Christianity, and so on, right? So on the one hand, you have, if you like, a religious doctrine that says we are all creatures, so we are all one. And on the other hand, you have political instruments like borders that make sure that that ideal of being one will not be realized.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the issue which that is raised by that is quite far-reaching. So, for example, and this is what Tricia was talking about. You know, this hypocrisy of being committed to well-being, to the well-being of Zimbabweans, for example, but not shy away from taking personnel from Zimbabwe to serve their own needs. And I mean, it's good for the nurses, right? But there is a larger thing here, right? Same thing, you know, happening at different levels. So there's no problem for Switzerland to take me away from Mozambique. Thank God for that. But, you know, in everything else, you know, if it's an African from whom they do not expect an immediate gain, they will create all sorts of barriers, right? So what is the broader narrative to this? That's the difficulty which I have, and that's why I describe this as an instance of this sovereign reason. Now, the other thing is that you have a lot of people. I mean, I just mentioned too. So there's this Korean economist from the University of Cambridge, Han-Jun Chang, who writes in these very popular and comical books that he's got, 23 things you don't know about capitalism, or you didn't know about capitalism and all that. You know, so he talks about migration in a particularly interesting way, you know, where he says a Swedish bus driver who is less competent than an Indian bus driver, you know, is paid much more than an Indian bus driver. Wouldn't it make sense for Sweden to actually hire Indian bus drivers to go to Stockholm and, you know, drive buses? And there's also this Dutch scholar, Rutger Bregman, who wrote the book Utopia for Realists, who's actually, you know, did the accounts and found out that European countries have much more to profit from liberalizing migration than they have from limiting it. So, so you see, there's a whole context within which morality does not match actions, right?
Okay.
And yet we are being invited to, if you like, accept their narrative of humanitarianism just like that.
Yes. So I just saw Divine writing that. So Eliseo, you're saying that humanitarianism equals a black box. That this discussion contributes to this black box. We want to hear the recordings on this box. So far, it's been a daunting work, and we will still continue to discuss. But now, I think there are some questions for you from Karina and where's yeah, Chikezie. So I will start with Chikezie, and then Karina, your question will follow. Chikezie, please go ahead.
Thanks, Kwaku. Hi, everyone. My question is simple. I was intrigued by Teresa's allusion to incomplete humanitarianism. I think it was intriguing to hear that, and I quite find it fascinating. And I was wondering whether Teresa believes that ethical humanitarianism could be the solution for incomplete humanitarianism. Okay. And if so, what does she think about what Eliseo says about him not really believing in ethical humanitarianism. That ethical humanitarianism is a kind of misunderstood concept.
Okay, thank you. Karina, please, we take also your question and then we can put the two together.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for the exchange. And I'm sorry if this topic has been touched upon because I had some technical difficulties in the beginning. But my question is or concerns language, how we talk about migration, what words and vocabulary we use, because this is extremely interesting for me. For example, why some people are expats and some are migrants. Where is the difference there? Or for example, why is it hipster and cool for some people not to learn a language? You know, living in a city, in a metropolitan city for Berlin for 10 years, but for some it's laziness and they just don't want to assimilate into the society. Or that refugees just have to be grateful. Isn't this like shifting or derailing the entire conversation? Why do rich countries, and I quote actually from this conversation, why do rich countries suffer under migration? Is this actually a moral way of talking about the subject, because who actually is suffering? So I would like to know if this is something that when you talk to people, that do you personally pay attention to, and are these structures that you actively try to break, and how do you do so? Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. There's another question from Asaf. And actually, Karina, you just touched on the question I was going to ask Eliseo, because he is into languages as well. I'm working on, I work a lot on migration governance on the continent, and it's very difficult. Sometimes you speak to people, they don't believe in the concepts that they mention, like irregular and all that, but still they had to use because that's what their partners are. These are all part of it. Thank you, Karina, for that question. So please, I hope you are taking notes of the questions. Now we have Asaf, and Asaf will go. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and hello, Professor Eliseo. Okay, I don't know if it's a question or trying to advertise my book and my article that's coming up soon. But anyway. So I think the language, I mean, when I just came to a conclusion, the language of expat is definitely used only, or is only applied to white people. It's just black and white, if you want to say it. And migration or refugee immigrant is used to black people. That's just how it is. And that's what I've been arguing in my book, and that's what I'm arguing in the article that I'm writing with Professor Russell King from Sussex. So I think in terms of language, this is just black and white. Also in terms of just who is considered migrant, who is considered not migrant. I mean, I have some American friends in Munich who have been living for 20 years. But
can you please make your question a bit shorter?
Yeah. I'm coming. Just hold your horses. And the Americans are really fine. If they live here for 20 years without speaking German, it's fine. But if someone else from outside, you know, doesn't speak the language, then it's problematic. And those are dynamics of power that exist within this global North and global South. And coming back to migration, I look at Portuguese migration to Angola after the 2008 economic crisis. And Professor Lisa Axon from Sweden also does the same. And she came to the conclusion that someone who is Portugal as construction worker arrives in Angola as an engineer. And now I'm looking at how skilled Angolans in Portugal end up working construction work with all the skills they have, speaking the language, well integrate, whatever integration is, but yet they don't get the same privileges that Portuguese have in Angola. And that is the balance, how just the hierarchy of race and who gets to get the position and so forth. That's just a comment that I want.
Thank you. Please tell us the title of your book that is coming up. You've already advertised it. We will be interested. Good. Not to South migration. Yes, not to South migration. Well,
the article is coming at the end of the year. So. Great.
Thank you for adding to the rich discussion that we are having now. So we have only 3 minutes to finish. and I would like to finish within 3 minutes. But Eliseo and Tricia are there. They are our honorary guests. So if they go above it a bit, I will be okay, because I'm not trying to be a border here. Yeah, so we can extend it a bit, but not too long. I think these questions are very, and this clarification. Thank you, Asaf, for the clarification. And the two questions that came are quite very, very, very important, that we cannot just run away with it. So I think who would like to take it first? Eliseo or Teresa, please?
Okay, I'll start,
yeah.
and then Eliseo can join in. I think to Chikezi's point, yes, obviously, if we could have an ethical humanitarianism, if it could in fact exist, and we could strip away all the politicization that takes place both around international aid, humanitarian assistance, even what is defined as an emergency, then yes, some of the incompleteness which I was talking about would fall away. But I'm beginning to think that we are so far from the type of ethical and perhaps moral principles that would have to underpin this unethical humanitarianism, that we are likely to remain at a practical level with this very incomplete process. Stop, start, on, off, very dominated by a Western discourse, very much rooted, in fact, in the 19th century notions that the industrialized world should, take some responsibility or try to help people in other countries. So yes, I do think my dilemma would be solved about the incompleteness of it all, if there were, and equally if there was some ethical premise to how migration is actually dealt with by countries, rather than the sort of scaremongering security issues that are thrown to the fore all the time, and the perception of, indeed, migrants as less than human. Karina, terminology is of course a huge issue, and one of the things which interested me when in some of the work I did among undocumented Zimbabweans here in Botswana, who are not particularly welcome, though they skirt the system to ensure that their livelihoods are protected. But one of the things which interested me was the way in which they vehemently denied the labels that were used by the state to categorize them, and were highly offended that their attempt and effort to make a living, to have a livelihood, to use their skills, whether it is as a carpenter or as an electrician or whatever, or indeed, lower levels of skills, that anyone who would call their attempt to make a living and a livelihood an illegal activity, or define them as illegal as opposed to undocumented. And indeed their questioning of the whole notion of documentation in a region where the borders are completely arbitrary colonial borders that don't even make a lot of sense most of the time. So I think the issue of terminology, both in relation to how we write about migrants, but not only the terminology that is used. What I don't see are enough people prepared to use the voices of migrants to challenge the terminology. We can challenge it and say that it is unacceptable to call a human being illegal. That is not at all as powerful as allowing a set of migrants who have been categorized in a derogatory way to make their case for why they fear or feel they should not be categorized or labeled in that particular way. Asaf, your idea about expatriates, I've never given very much thought to the word expatriate until I came to Botswana. And then I'm originally from Ireland, though I had previously lived for quite a long period in Zimbabwe, where I was simply a resident, or had acquired a residence on the basis of marriage. But I had never really thought about the term expatriate until I came to Botswana, when I found myself categorized as an expatriate. So I didn't quite know what this meant, or what the heck is all this about, and what am I supposed to do as an expatriate, as opposed to somebody who is an outsider or a migrant into the society with a particular skill. And it seems to me there are two things. First of all, an expatriate implies some type of skill that is desirable by the state and some type of conditions of service, but it also goes with a caveat. It is also used to exclude. So often the terms and conditions under which you work as an expatriate, for example, say here, mean that the years during which you are an expatriate do not entitle you to any type of permanent residence, any type of long-term stay. So it is a kind of a constant temporary status, right? Even though it may be reasonably well rewarded and so forth. On the other hand, I have some sympathy for your view that there may be a sort of almost color dimension to the term expatriate, because one of the things I have seen here is as the number of so-called expatriates, let's say where I work at the university, is declining for a host of very complex reasons, especially those who come from Europe, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, or wherever. And the number of those from African countries sort of was increasing, though that has now also begun to decline. There was a shift and less of a discourse and a language around expatriate when it came to the sort of, my African colleagues and my colleagues from other African societies. Now, how deep that was or how much of a real shift was happening, or this was just noticeable in a period when a lot of transition was taking place anyway in relation to who was working at the institution, I'm not completely sure. Okay, Alicio.
Okay. Thank you. Alicio?
Thank you. This is so interesting. It's such a pity.
Tricia took 5 minutes, so let's see how well you can do.
Okay. Okay, so I think the first thing I want to say is addressed to Chikesia, just to introduce a nuance in your question. I think the answer was great. So really, I do think that the potential for there to be something that we might call ethical humanitarianism is there. There are a lot of people out there who are really committed to what they're doing, right? And they do that out of good reasons, good moral reasons. The only thing is that they do that within a highly problematic context, right? So where there is always a gap between, if you like, moral principles and practice. Mm-hmm. And in fact, politics here in Europe and elsewhere is always based on that gap. It's almost like people are saying to you, when it comes down to hard matters of politics, then the safest thing to do is to give up on values, on moral principles, right? And that is what makes it difficult for there to be ethical humanitarianism, one that we would all commit to and agree with, right? So that is what leaves me unimpressed when I see people doing great work, because I know that behind that, there's a problem, right? Now, the answer to Karina's question and to Asaf's comment, I think, and also Divine's invitation to reflect on the black box, you see, we like to think that we use language to describe reality. And that is true, but only up to a point. We actually use language to simplify reality. That is what we do. And in the process of simplifying reality, we mask things, right? And that is why the concepts that we use they operate, if you like black boxes, right? You know, we see all these nodes and discrete entities, but they are trying to represent a reality which is far more complex than what they can be able to represent, than what they can be able to describe. And curiously enough, in the process of masking, if you pay attention to that, that's where you see the real world. So when you see nuances being introduced to describe migrants, you know, so when you say this migrant here is not a migrant, he's an expatriate, that should invite you to reflect on the real world, you know, because that is the description of the world. Yeah. Why should not all people be described as migrants? Full stop. Why do we need all these qualifications? Tricia was talking about illegal migrants and so on. Why do we need all of this? Because we realize that our language, which is there to simplify reality, is inadequate, right? The world that we are trying to simplify is far more complex than that, right? And because Tricia said she came from Ireland, and this reminds me of a book which I think is quite interesting by Noel Ignatieff, an American historian, and it's called How the Irish Became White, right? And it's quite interesting because, of course, we know the history of Irish migration to the United States, the potato famine, and all of that. And so they were very poor and they were very low in the social structure of America. And for them to rise up, one of the things that they had to do was to prove themselves to be more oppressive than American society was towards Black people.
Yeah.
Right? And in that way, they became white.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So language, I think looking at language from this perspective, and I'm grateful to Karina for raising this question, is very useful because it makes us aware not only of the limitations of our conceptual vocabularies, but also of the complex nature of the thing that we want to understand.
Thank you, Alicio, and thank you, Tricia, and thank you all for the questions that came. I would like to imagine this as well. So the discussion so far has drawn on quite a number of issues that actually has gone beyond what I even imagined the discussion would be about, and this has enriched the whole discussion so well, such that now when we talk about, so in this case, then I would rather, as we go, perhaps Alicio and Teresa, as we go. Now, the idea that we're saying that, especially from you, Alicio, when you mentioned that governments need to set up, government needs to do this, government, if we see governments are going into corporations, they are going into agreement, arrangements, and if these arrangements are the same ways that the same things as you answered my first question, that creating borders, these are the same things that are creating problems for us, then where lies now the way forward? I think in all our sessions, we have to go home with something. We are not assuming that there is no way out. Then all hands raised, everything is doomed. How can we go with, or what can we take out of this discussion as something that we can take along? Because we can't rely on government. We've seen this. It's governments that are causing all these mass exodus of the exodus of people, and so when the narrative is still on, government have to do this, government have to do this. It looks as if there is no other way we can tackle these issues than to leave the same governments that will lead us in. And I'm not speaking this as a rebel to government or undermining the role of democracy, but I'm talking about what can we live here with as something we can take home beside relying on governments that are causing more barriers and borders to the same development they are seeking for. And as we have the platform, what can we contribute on? And I want just one or two statements from both of you so we can go and sleep quite a bit, so we don't go and have bad dreams about the world. It's enough already. So what will you say is your take-home phrase, sentence that we can take from this discussion?
Okay, that's an easy one.
Mm-hmm.
Down with borders.
Down with borders. Thank you. Teresa?
Incomplete humanitarianism or humanitarian approaches are no match for the power of migrant agency.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You know, that's why you have doctors, whatever, without borders. They all want to operate without borders, but they found themselves even in the border construction itself. Yeah. So no borders, and no matter what, migrants agency is the key. Thank you very much. And all of us, with our pens, whatever we write, whatever we contribute, wherever we get a chance to discuss some of these issues, we need to get the narrative right. And I think the speakers today have done that for us today. Thank you.
Thank
Divine,
you,
please.
Thank you, Kweku, and thank you, Elisio and Triasa. It is good to see that we inherited, we were trained by great people. So thank you for committing to this, and also to the audience. And just to say that Triasa is at the University of Botswana, and she's very generous with her intellectual work and also friendship. So do not hesitate, to contact her. She's doing amazing work around migration and also refugee and humanitarian work in Southern Africa and also across the world, as you would have seen. And Elisio Makamo is at the University of Basel, but with the virtual live, he is everywhere right now, and he's doing a lot of really important work around, thinking through scientific conceptual vocabularies, which I really also believe is at the bedrock of having to give flesh to decolonial or to decolonization. I mean, we cannot move a step if we do not have tools, to begin to rethink what's the point of going to your farm without your own tools. So it's great, and also looking forward to the book by Elisio Makamo, which is forthcoming with African Minds. That's Thierry Luchter and Francoise van Scheckling. They're doing amazing work in African Minds, and look out for the book Sovereign Reason, Essays in Methodology of African Studies, published by them. And we're going to meet again in September, on September 21st, for another session with Ebrima Sal, who is Executive Director of Trust Africa and a former Executive Secretary of Codesia, and was also a senior researcher at the in the African Center in the Nordic Africa Institute in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And he will be talking with the former director of the Nordic Africa Institute, Ina Sori, who is currently at the Finnish Cooperation in Pretoria. So thank you very much. Have a great evening, and see you next time.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.